the way machines expanded the reach of human muscle in the last century. Just look at the calculator. We're now all math geniuses. That's the promise. The key question is, how do we make the transition from one era to the next? Right now, the American economy is growing too slowly. We could be growing 3 times the rate we are today if we make some of these changes that I've talked about, reducing the tax burden, regulatory burden, and also, too, we have to talk about schools in America. They're not educating our kids properly. That's why we need parental control and choice in our schools. If we want opportunity to be a real word for all Americans and not just a word of rhetoric, we have to start with our education system, particularly in the inner cities, and then take it around America. So it starts with education, tax reform, regulatory reform, lowering interest rates, and then America's traditional strengths will come back, and not only will we be able to compete with the world, we will lead the world.
A very quick follow-up, John, before we move on to Mr. Alexander. How can we be sure that companies would use the tax breaks that you're advocating to hire more workers instead of just increasing their profits?
Well, every time the tax burden first has been removed on the American people, the economy has blossomed. And every time we've allowed more investment in America, the whole economy has blossomed. You don't have to rely on existing companies. As I said, new companies created 14 million new jobs, including a record number of high-paid jobs in the 1980s. So even if existing companies don't do it, I guarantee you that a flurry of small and new businesses will more than take up the slack. That's been our strength before, and it can be our strength again.
Let's get some comment from Governor Alexander on this.
Let me try to get this down to the terms in which I'm used to working with it. We like the robots in our state. They're at the Saturn plant. They're at the Nissan plant. They're at the parts suppliers. We never had them before. And now we're the 3rd largest automobile producer, and our incomes have been going straight up. And that reminds us, when I go into the schools in my state, that to be on the headlight assembly team at the Saturn plant, you've got to know mathematics, you've got to know statistics, you've got to speak English well, you've got to be a part of a team. So we went to work on education. And as a country, we need to have the growth environment. I agree with Mr. Forbes. That's what I worked for hard in my state. But more importantly, we need to go back to something you talked about, helping workers go from one job to the next. I'd take the job training programs we have that are federal, turn them into work scholarships for people changing jobs. I think the college grants and loans are very important. You go to a college commencement, it's way to go mom. It's mom going back to school to get a job. I think we need to make it easier in our new tax system for pensions and health care to follow you from one job to the next. And I would create a GI Bill for kids to help middle and low income families, especially in the inner cities, have a chance to go to the best schools, because education is at the key of revaluing labor. So I think robots help us keep a higher standard of living in a more competitive world. If we didn't have them, our incomes would be going straight down.
Governor, thank you. Let's go to the next panelist, Jamie Dupree, WSB Radio Washington correspondent.
Governor Alexander, a good deal of this campaign so far is centered on the issue of family values, as the 3 of you and other candidates have tried to garner the support of religious conservatives around the country, especially here in the South. Now, even with a moment of silence here in Georgia, the issue of school prayer is a very controversial one. Let me ask you directly, do you support a constitutional amendment that would allow states to allow for school prayer as a way to promote that within the schools? Would you support that?
Well, not to begin with. I signed a law as governor that passed a law permitting a minute of silence in a school, which could be used for prayer or anything else. And I believe the federal Congress ought to start with that. Let the Supreme Court review it, and perhaps the Supreme Court will change its mind. I think it made a mistake in 1961 when it interpreted the Constitution so rigidly and made it hard for us to freely express our religious beliefs in this country. And going back to the first part of your question, I'm not for family values because of Christian conservatives. I'm a Christian. I'm generally conservative. I think most people in this country believe our most difficult problem is the breakdown of the American family. And I think the first job of the next president is to try to set a good example, to lecture Hollywood and television trash, to stop Washington from undermining personal responsibility, and remind us that we need to rebuild families, neighborhoods, churches, synagogues, and schools if we're going to have a bright future. That's the most important thing we have to do in America, and it's not just a matter of the school prayer decision. That's part of it, but that's only part.
Mr. Buchanan.
Yeah, first, there's no more eloquent spokesman on the issue of the moral crisis in America, which is at the heart of the social crisis, than the gentleman we wouldn't let in here tonight, or the folks would not let in here tonight, and that's Alan Keyes. Alan Keyes has been an eloquent debater. I think he belonged in this debate. He has been excellent when he has done debates, and I regret he is not here. Now let me talk about the prayer, school prayer. First, the Constitution, Lamar, did not rigidly interpret, the Supreme Court did not rigidly interpret the Constitution. It misinterpreted it. For decades and decades and generations, it made a major blunder. And what it did was it threw prayer out of the public schools where prayer had been commonplace for generations. Founding Fathers did not intend that. We have a Supreme Court and had a Supreme Court which is running about imposing its own views and values on a society which disbelieves in those. I don't think we need a constitutional amendment. I will support a constitutional amendment to allow prayer in the public schools, the posting of the Ten Commandments once again. But I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to have Supreme Court justices, unlike the two my friend Senator Dole voted for, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer, who will interpret the Constitution as the Founding Fathers wrote it. But we also need a more muscular Christianity in America, and those of us of all traditional views. The Founding Fathers would not have tolerated for 10 seconds the King of England telling him to get the Bible out of their public schools. The revolution would have started even earlier had they tried that. And I think we got to stand up for our rights. We are a religious people. Voluntary prayer, voluntary Bible reading, voluntary religious expression and religious teaching in the public schools. I will try to make the law of the land in every way I can.
Mr. Forbes, your comment on this?
I think the Supreme Court did make a mistake. I think that there is no harm at all and positive good to have a moment of silence, at least in the public schools. Congress should pass such a law, and I'm sure that the courts will begin to see the light on it. We have a moral foundation in America. Our rights are derived from God. Our Founding Fathers made that very clear when they have created this nation. Moreover, today, it is kind of weird, to put it gently, that in a public school, you cannot post the Ten Commandments, but you can post pinups from pornographic magazines. This year was the 10th anniversary of the Challenger tragedy. 10 years ago, students around the country and teachers said they found it very constricting and artificial that they couldn't have a moment of prayer when they saw that Challenger disaster on TV. So something is fundamentally wrong, and we can correct it. But in a larger sense, I think America is on the verge of another awakening of a series of religious and spiritual movements that we've had before in this country. The great strength of the American democracy is not that we don't make mistakes. We're human and we do. But when we do stumble or fall, we not only pick ourselves up, but we find the inner strength to reach new heights. Working together, we've done it before. Working together, we can do it again. Values and economics go hand in hand in America. And by values, I mean sanctity of life, hard work, faith, thrift, trust, a belief in progress, a belief in individual responsibility and opportunity, and a belief that we're on this earth and in this land for a higher purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Forbes. Next question now from panelist Tom Baxter, political editor of the Atlanta Constitution.
Mr. Buchanan,
Yes, sir.
contract with America helped to sweep in the first Republican House majority in over 40 years. But since then, a number of the items have gotten snared in Congress, and there's even been a certain degree of second guessing about whether the contract was what Americans really wanted in the first place. If it came up again today, would you sign the contract? And if your answer is yes, how would you move it along through Congress?
I think, my friend, that I certainly would sign the contract. I support all of its provisions. Some of them I don't think were quite bold enough. You had to get a 70% approval to get onto the contract. But I would certainly sign it. The one part that didn't even get through the House was term limits. And I think some of our Republican friends don't genuinely believe in term limits. They pay lip service to them. Let me tell you how I would solve the problem of term limits on members of Congress. Supreme Court, by 5-4, threw out the term limits proposal that had passed in 25 states. States had set term limits on Congress, most of them 6 years in the House, 12 in the Senate. Supreme Court says you can't do that. States don't have that right. I would send legislation to Congress that said this: the states do have the right to set term limits on members of Congress. Secondly, the United States Supreme Court has no appellate review jurisdiction over this law. It affects the Congress of the United States. We are writing this law. The President is going to sign it. And I would get that, pass it into law, and let the states start passing term limits on members of Congress. And I would challenge the Supreme Court to overturn that, because I believe, again, the Supreme Court is acting unconstitutionally. The President, as Jefferson said, and the Congress have their own powers and rights to interpret the Constitution as they see fit. If you remember, Thomas Jefferson took the Alien and Sedition Acts, which locked up journalists, some feel not a bad idea, and he said, after it was over, he said, I don't care that Congress passed it or the Supreme Court approved it or they're sending journalists to jail. I'm turning them all free. I'm not prosecuting anyone because this law violates the Constitution according to my interpretation. And it stood. We need that kind of executive in the White House again, and I think I may be just the man.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. Governor Alexander, any response?
Tom, I gave Newt Gingrich an A+ for leadership, and I gave the contract an A+ in 1994 during the campaign when a lot of people were making fun of it. I think it was a very bold step, and I think it raises the question as undecided voters look tonight and think about which one of us to vote for, or Senator Dole. Let's remember, he's a part of this discussion. Which one of us can help put the contract and the Republican Revolution from 1994 back on the front burner and actually help get it done? I mean, we got very excited about the Republican Congress, at least we Republicans did. But we haven't got the balanced budget amendment. We haven't got term limits. We haven't got the Education Department abolished. We haven't got welfare really changed, and we're not going to until we have a Republican president who can help explain to the country what needs to be done. That's why I believe I'm a better choice than Senator Dole, because he's already there. I don't think we need to move a Senate leader down the street. I think we need to have a different kind of person who can go across this country, set an agenda, first beat Bill Clinton, then get a lot of independents and Democrats behind our ideas. Otherwise, the contract's going to stay stuck, no matter how good Bob Dole is or Newt Gingrich is at a legislative job.
Thank you. Mr. Forbes.
Well, the problem with the contract was that it was not bold enough, particularly on the tax side. And one mistake the Republicans did make in Congress was they did not emphasize that all of these provisions are a means to an end of getting America moving again, of making that word opportunity a word of reality for all Americans. So they should have gone with a flat tax, junked the tax code. They should have pushed seriously term limits, which they really didn't do. If you want to change the culture of Washington, which is not the culture of America, you must first change the biggest source of power in Washington, which is the tax code. For generations now, it's been the favorite sport there of exchanging loopholes for political cash and contributions. That is morally corrupt. That's why the tax code is a cesspool of legalized corruption today. The second thing you must do to change the culture of Washington is enact term limits. Short, if we're going to get America moving, it means less government, more freedom. And the contract is simply a small step in the right direction. We need to make much bolder steps.
But given that, would you sign it or not?
Sure, but I would say, especially on the tax side, it is just a start. There's much more that has to be done.
This is near beer, as they used to say.
Thank you very much. We're
Warm
gonna...
light is not going to get America moving again.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to take a short break right now. In just a minute, the candidates are going to get the chance to ask questions of each other. Stay with us. Welcome back to Channel 2's 96 Vote, Georgia's Republican presidential primary debate. At this point now, we're going to turn the questioning over to the candidates for a few minutes. We're going to give them the opportunity to question each other. Now, the order was selected by lot prior to the program. First, we're going to let Steve Forbes ask a question of one of the other two. You have 30 seconds for the question, 90 seconds to respond.
Good. I'm going to ask Pat a question. Pat, you've proposed tariffs on certain countries of 20 to 40%. That is simply, as you know, a tariff is another word for a tax, a 20 to 40% sales tax. That means people are going to pay 40% more for their VCRs, microwave ovens, and the like. Why is it that politicians seem to think that raising taxes is going to help the American people? How does that help the American people, raising their cost of living, raising taxes?
I think your problem is, Steve, that you really haven't read and studied this issue the way I have. First off, when I say we're going to put a 40% tariff on Chinese communist goods, you've obviously not read the point that for every dime we get in revenue from those tariffs on Chinese communist goods, I'm going to use that to eliminate the taxes on small businesses in the United States. $12 billion in revenue from tariffs can virtually eliminate the taxes on small business. So, okay, we put the taxes on the Chinese communist goods. People can buy them or not buy them. But we do cut the taxes on American small businesses. Now, in this country in the 19th century, and I'm surprised you didn't study this up at Princeton or that little prep school you went to, Steve, but the whole country
Pat,
was
this is a
financed
debate, not
was
crossfire.
financed on tariffs. All four men on Mount Rushmore believe that the United States should protect our manufacturing base, not have it gutted and sent abroad, that we should use taxes on imports to pay for the government of the United States, and no income taxes on American citizens, almost entirely during the 19th, earliest 20th century. We went from a small agricultural country to the most powerful nation on earth that way. I'm sure Cal Coolidge is one of your heroes. He did two things, Steve. He cut taxes from 90% to 25%, which I'm sure you'd approve of, tax rates, and he put the Fordney-McCumber tariff on goods coming in from abroad. We had the greatest boom in history, and it is mythology to say that Smoot-Hawley or Hawley-Smoot, whichever you prefer, was responsible for the Great Depression. Steve, you've been miseducated. I don't care how much that school cost you. You've been miseducated, my
Pat,
friend.
in the 19th century, we had horse-drawn carriages, and we're not going to go back to those. In fact, after the 1890s, when we became an industrial nation, every time we raised tariffs, we got a depression or recession. And let me give you a lesson, Pat. I did learn something. The Fordney-McCumber tariff was actually a reduction from the emergency wartime rates.
Well,
so
listen,
that was a tariff reduction. And when
Listen,
we put
you
in
better
Smoot-
read. Woodrow Wilson was the one that reduced the
We-
tariffs. It was Harding and
Pat.
Coolidge, those two solid
Yes, but,
Republicans.
Pat, I'm giving you an education.
This
During
is
World
interesting
War
history,
I,
gentlemen, but-
During World War I, the tariffs were raised, supposedly temporarily. The Fordney-McCumber tariff actually reduced those
How
rates.
do you explain
So we
how
got
we
a
became
tax
the
cut,
greatest
So
industrial
we got
power?
a tax cut
All right,
and
Steve,
we got a tariff cut.
how do you explain
That's
how
why
we
we got the
became...
boom in the 20s.
How do
Could
you
I say a
explain...
little word
Yeah,
about the future?
jump right in here.
Mr.
Please go,
Zachary.
Alexander.
Let's
Quickly.
look ahead a little bit. Now, Pat, you're a very smart guy. But explain to me, if we put a tariff on the Japanese, as you suggest, we pay it. That comes out of our pocket. Then they buy their soybeans from Brazil instead of us. That comes out of our pocket. We get hurt twice. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, Steve's right about this. I think we're all right about this. You're wrong about this. This is the Buchananism that would take us straight down in the New South. We're sitting here in Atlanta. I mean, if you were president, instead of the Olympic Games, they'd be playing intramural football.
Quick response. Japan has bought 400,000 cars from us and sold 40 million in the last 25 years. They have a $60 billion trade surplus. If you are afraid to stand up to Tokyo and Mr. Hashimoto, Lamar, you don't belong in the White House, and you don't understand
Pat.
our manufacturing base is being hollowed out, my friends.
We're ready to
half
sell
of our
Saturns made in
imports-
Tennessee to
Do you know how
Tokyo.
small our auto industry compared to what it used to be? Japan has 25% of our
record
auto
sales,
industry.
Pat. Maybe
We
I
got
haven't gotten the
1%
word.
of theirs.
But Pat,
If you get tough with
over
them,
half of our imports
Stop being
are
so
industrial
timid, my friends.
equipment and products for our own companies. You raise those and you make us
Look,
uncompetitive.
look, I agree with
And
you there.
Pat,
Hold
I
it.
think the
If you're
voters
talking
are on,
about-
I think the voters are on to the notion of politicians
Look.
promising to cut one tax, raise one tax to cut another.
Look, we do have a debate here. Take a
it
look.
ends up
Take a
coming
look
out of
at
the,
on the
out of the
battlefields
hearts
of
of the
business.
American people.
On the battlefields of business, millions of casualties. 3 out of 4 American homes have suffered because of these downsizing of businesses. 19 million workers have been thrown out in a major crisis
But Pat,
because you are exporting the best jobs in this country. They're not your job, Steve, and they're not your job, Lamar. They're the jobs of the working
Pat,
man.
when
and
I
Gentlemen,
women in
let's,
this
let's,
country.
let's cut it right here and
Well,
move
all right.
into the next question, because this may come up again.
Well, I hope that
I hope it does.
I hope that it does.
Well, it's
because
Mr.
this is a
Buchanan's
very,
time to ask a
very
question.
important
Maybe
point.
he'll question you, but it's your question.
All right, I'm going to throw a light one out. Lamar, listen. You've said you're the only fellow that can beat Bill Clinton, right? Or you're the one that certainly can.
I said ABC. I can
Yeah,
beat Clinton
all right.
best, right?
Why didn't you beat me in a single primary or caucus? Alaska, Louisiana, Iowa, New Hampshire, Arizona, Delaware, South Carolina. You didn't beat me in one. If you can beat Bill Clinton, why can't you beat me?
Well, if I could get the others out of the race and get a two-man
When
race
they get out of
on
the race,
Pat,
I'm gonna win it.
You'd be out shortly. Second, you've been on Crossfire doing a tremendous job. I mean, you've been waging
agree
a
with
battle
that.
up there as a commentator.
I agree with that.
Everybody knows who you are.
Yeah.
And
They've
they're
come to love me.
they're just getting to know me. But in the last week of the New Hampshire primary, 2/3 of the people made their minds up. Now, you and I know this is true, and I won more votes in the last week than anybody else, which is why our friend Senator Dole took all his positive ads off and ran negative ads against me. The other answer to your question, now I'm
Go ahead.
answering. The other answer is take a poll at the Clinton White House and see who they think
All right,
Mr.
why-
Clinton would be afraid to run
Why
against.
did I beat you in the Democratic primary in New Hampshire? I got 3,400 write-in votes, ran second to Clinton among Democrats. And who can better bring home the Perot voters? Buchanan, how would you bring home these voters who detest NAFTA and detest GATT?
Pat, because I would say to them, I spent the last 15 years not standing in front of closing plants. I tried that for a while. I got in the newspaper and I figured out if all I do is stand in front of closing plants, we won't have any jobs left. I changed
You're
my
right.
tactics.
You got to have a
No,
policy
no,
to
no.
stop them sending those jobs away and closing
I
those
thought I was
plants.
answering the
Let
question.
him answer,
Pat.
Mr. Buchanan,
Now,
please.
I changed my tactics. I put my focus on the job spigot, not the job drain. And I went to work creating job growth, joining the world. We sold our soybeans, our cotton, our corn, our Jack Daniels, our country music. We're now ready to sell the Saturns around the world, and our incomes went straight up. So when they find more out about me, they'll think a Republican governor from the
Better
New
happen
South.
soon, Lamar.
Pat,
It better
you
happen
know the
soon,
story
my
of
friend.
the tortoise and the hare. I'm
Right.
coming right up. We have 90% of the delegates yet to
Right.
pick, and the more they get to know me, the better they're going to like me, and you'll
Right.
be good back on crossfire when this is all over.
Governor Alexander, your time to pose a question to either candidate.
I'm going to pose one. I'm very tempted to go back to Pat. Let me pose one
Thank you.
to Steve, if I may. When I was governor, I was considered to be a pretty good team leader. I had a Democratic legislature. I tried to get people to work together. We made a lot of progress, we thought. And let me try the ultimate challenge here. We've been beating each other's brains out lately in these debates. So let me say that one thing I like about Steve's campaign is his emphasis on growth, because I was a growth governor. One thing I like about Pat's campaign is that Pat
Get back
talks
to the chair.
about ideas. Well,
what's
he
your
does.
question?
A contest
got
of
bad
ideas. My
ideas.
question is this. Steve, what's one thing you like about my campaign and one thing you like about Pat's campaign?
This is charity night. I think the key is the only way, getting back to the whole question of how you beat Bill Clinton and which campaign can do it, really is vision. That is, how best do we get less government and more freedom? I've put proposals on the table to do it. And with Lamar's campaign, he asked, what do I like about it? I like the idea that he talks about, makes vague noises about, reducing taxes. But one thing he hasn't done yet, and I hope you do it maybe tonight, Lamar, is to put on the table specifically, not just talk about tax cuts or what you might like to cut, but give some hard numbers. I've put hard proposals on the table to reduce taxes. I'm glad you've talked about it. That's a good thing about your campaign. Talk about specifics. Specifically, what are you going to cut and how much are you going to cut it? Now, the one thing I like about Pat's campaign is that he has touched on something, that there is an extraordinary time of change in America, and people's lives are being disrupted. The question, of course, is what we do about it. In this case, we have a case where the diagnosis is right, but the prescription will do what the physicians used to do, and that is kill the patient. We don't need to destroy jobs, we need to create jobs. And I have a program and with principles to do that. So they're partway there in their campaigns, but I need to learn a little more, Lamar, about your tax program. And Pat, I think you got the wrong prescription. It's going to be like what physicians did 200 years ago when you got sick in America. They
But
used
at
to bleed
least-
you, and that killed the patient.
But at least we diagnosed it and nobody else did. Isn't that right, Lamar? And isn't that right, Steve?
Now, Pat,
and isn't that a tremendous achievement?
But-
Having
but
pointed out...
Don't say nobody
point-
else did, Pat, because I've been
Well-
working on that for 15... My whole focus since I was governor of Tennessee in 1979 is raising family incomes because people were losing jobs. I don't focus on the plant closings.
But,
I focus on
Lamar,
how we replace the
But
jobs.
you sat
and
there
we're
right
very
in an
successful.
administration that put the biggest tax increase on American history. I went to New Hampshire. I
I
protested
was not
it.
there then, Pat.
But you were part of that administration. It added more regulators than Ronald Reagan was able to cut. It imposed quotas on small business. It raised taxes more than any other. When I went up there in New Hampshire to fight that tax increase, no one stood with me. You did not.
No, I
Maybe
supported
Steve. Were you
President
with me
Bush.
out there, Steve? I'm not sure. But we were out there fighting against, I fought every tax increase under Ronald Reagan and under George Bush as well.
All right.
But you shifted gears just a little bit. My whole career has been helping one of the poorest states become the fastest growing state in family income.
Gentlemen, let's
not by
move on.
focusing on jobs we're losing,
let's
but
move
on
on.
jobs we're creating.
Excuse me, let's move on to a question from the panelist, Bill Nigut.
Ms. Forbes, today in New York, you called on Mr. Buchanan, in your words, to profoundly apologize for some of his past statements about minorities. Polls in some of the states are suggesting that voters think Mr. Buchanan is extreme in his views. Would you like to talk to him directly? He's here now with you in Georgia. Has he made provocative statements that you think he needs to apologize for? And what kind of statements do you think he's making out there?
Well, clearly, if you read his columns, he did make statements that I think are over the line and unacceptable. For example, he said on the Gulf War that the only supporters of our going to war against Iraq were the Israeli Defense Ministry, and these are his words, the Amen corner of Israel and Congress. I found that objectionable. He's also defended Nazis that we tried to deport, including a fellow named Linus 10 years ago, and those kinds of statements, I think, go beyond the bounds. Bill Buckley, don't take my word for it, Bill Buckley, a highly respected conservative, examined those statements and also found them unacceptable.
I'm suggesting that you all campaign at long range from one another most of the time. You've got him in the studio with you. Do you want to specifically tell him that you want him to apologize?
Well,
Let
look,
him
let me
explain-
talk
let him
directly to
explain
those,
those.
since you've made the point. Look, I said during the Gulf War, which initially I opposed going to war in August of 1990, I thought it would have been a disaster, that the Israeli Defense Ministry was beating the drums for war, and it does have an Amen corner in the United States. Many people and columnists and AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, wanted that war very badly. I did not think it was in the national interest of the United States. The Israeli lobby is a very powerful institution in Washington. I have no hesitancy in standing up when I think the interests of my country are in jeopardy and taking on anyone. I am a controversial columnist because I will say things others will not say. I will take stands against very powerful institutions. With regard to Mr. Linus, I defended first John Demjanjuk for 10 years until the Israeli Supreme Court stood up after the man was about to be hanged and said, Pat Buchanan was right, we have the wrong man.
they
I
did
thank
not say
God
that.
I
They
stood
did
up
not
for that
say
man and prevented that atrocity. On Carl Linus, all I suggested was he be given an American trial, not sent back to the Soviet Union where they cut him open in 9 days and put him to death. I wanted American justice in this case, where he could be defended by American lawyers and prosecuted by American lawyers. And I stand up for American justice, and what was done in sending people back to Moscow under the communists was, in my judgment, appalling.
Did you have something to offer, Governor Alexander?
Yes, I think this discussion proves conclusively why we shouldn't have columnists as president and why we ought to elect someone who's worked creating jobs, improving schools, building stronger families as president. I mean, there's a very different job description here from Mr. Buchanan and Mr. Forbes and what I've spent my life doing, or what Senator Dole has spent his life doing. Let's don't forget him. He's supposed to be here tonight, and he's supposed to be being compared with us in terms of his vision of the future.
And we wish
But
you were
but
here.
also, too, in terms of job descriptions, I've run a real business for 10 years. Now, it's true what my opponents say, that I did come to the attention of top management at Forbes magazine at a fairly young age. But I have run a real business for 10 years, met real payrolls, met the needs of real customers, been around America for 25 years, and I've seen firsthand, unlike those who've spent a lifetime in politics, people struggling to start businesses. I've seen firsthand what holds them back and what enables them to get ahead. And so in that sense, I bring something a little different to the table. I do write commentary, but I never wrote, for example, as Pat did. He did say that Hitler was a courageous man.
Quick rejoinder,
I'm
Mr.
going to have a
Buchanan.
rejoinder here. Look, let's talk about resumes. Listen, when you were up there going to Princeton, I was an assistant to the President of the United States, writing foreign policy briefing books for Richard Nixon, writing speeches on the Vietnam War. I've gone to summits with 2 presidents. I've spent 8 years in the White House. I know what the White House requires, and here Lamar is right. It is not a congressional deal maker. It is someone who's got a vision for America, who has an agenda for the future, who has the courage of his convictions and will do controversial things, and who has the capacity to communicate through that television, radio, and newspapers and lead this country. It needs a man with what Ronald Reagan had, not with what Senator Dole has. And I think that in that arena, Pat Buchanan does not come up short.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. Let's get a question from Cynthia Tucker.
Mr. Forbes, last year, last March, a bipartisan federal commission issued a report which showed that women do indeed hit a glass ceiling in the workplace, and they are unable to advance to the highest positions of managing, highest executive positions. Does the federal government have a role to play in ensuring that women get a fair chance at advancing to the highest levels of corporate management?
Obviously, discrimination is wrong, it's illegal, and where it's found, it should be punished, and punished vigorously. America is supposed to be a nation of genuine opportunity, where regardless of the circumstances of your birth, regardless of where you were raised, you have a decent chance to get ahead. It's part and parcel of the American dream, which is allowing each of us, all of us, the chance to discover and develop to the fullest our God-given talents. And part of the problem with America today is if there is discrimination, we must fight it. But also a very serious problem in America today is we don't have the growth rates that we need to create those jobs and better paying jobs. And also, too, we have a crisis in the American family. A lot of people don't want a two-income family. They prefer a one-income one, just as we had in previous generations. People rightly ask, why is it that two incomes in a generation can't do the job that one income could in previous generations? And one of the chief villains is a tax code with those immorally high tax rates. Interest rates are too high. We once had 4.5% mortgages in America.
Let me ask you again,
and finally,
does the federal government have a role to play in ensuring that women get a fair chance
not
in
ensuring
advancing to the highest levels?
What they have, we don't want quotas. What we do want is genuine, open opportunity. That's what makes America move forward.
All right,
the problem with the federal government, in the name of opening up opportunity, is they try to dictate results, and that is not American.
Hold on. This is not a board meeting at Forbes magazine, my friend. Others get to speak here. Let me say this. There's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it. Let me give you an example of the highest corporate executive I picked is my sister, Babe Buchanan, who happens to run my campaign and ran it in 1992, was the youngest treasurer in the history of the United States, and will be in my administration overseeing exactly this. Yes, the federal government does have a role in seeing to it that women are not discriminated against in the workplace. However, we believe in equal opportunity for all and equal justice under law, but special privilege for none. All quotas, all affirmative action programs, all racial gender set-asides that give specific jobs to people based on background or color, they go out the window when Pat Buchanan becomes president. They are gone. We want people to be advanced on merit, ability, character, excellence, not on whether they're woman or man or black or white. We don't want them held back either. But I tell you this, my strongest support comes from women, not college graduates, but women making less than $30,000 a year who never went to college. They are looking to me for hope to keep their jobs, which are not the kind of jobs that robots do. They're the kind of jobs that women do with 2 or 3 kids and when they're down there working in a textile mill. And we cannot sell out these people, even as we move into the future with this third wave nonsense.
Mr. Buchanan.
We cannot sell out those working men and women.
Very quick, Governor Alexander, response to this, and then we'll go to closing
Well,
statements.
the answer is yes to your question. That would be a start. And the first thing the federal government can do is the president can set a good example. When I was governor, I appointed half the women cabinet members who'd ever been appointed in our state's 200-year history. The second thing to do is education. There's been a big change since 1970. The way to break the glass ceiling is by giving women more opportunities to become educated and to hold a good job. Look at the changes in our colleges and universities today. There are more women in our colleges today,
Governor,
than there are men. And that will break its way up through the top as executives make decisions.
Going to have to stop you there, Governor, because it's time for closing statements from each candidate. They will have 90 seconds to sum up their thoughts, and we'll begin with Mr. Buchanan.
Well, thank you very much. I do regret that Alan Keyes was not here, and I also regret that Senator Dole was not here, and I don't think Senator Dole has an excuse. But let me say this. I think this battle is coming down to Pat Buchanan and Bob Dole. And Bob Dole's been a friend of mine, but he is a Beltway insider who has collaborated with Bill Clinton time and again. He collaborated with Mr. Clinton in selling out American sovereignty to the World Trade Organization. He collaborated in the GATT and NAFTA agreements, which sold out the interests of American workers. He collaborated with Mr. Clinton in putting American ground troops into Bosnia when he should have stood up and opposed him. He has collaborated on putting very liberal Supreme Court Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer onto the Supreme Court when these two individuals have not only locked in Roe v. Wade for half a decade, they have ended term limits. Bill Clinton and Bob Dole have been together on the Mexican bailout, the $50 billion ripoff of American taxpayers to save a corrupt government's credit rating in Mexico. I believe that there's one candidate in this race who can not only debate Bill Clinton and stand up toe-to-toe, but can bring those Democrats home to the Republican Party, can bring those Perot voters home to the Republican Party, and can unite this party and give it energy and fire and the enthusiasm of the Buchanan movement along with the Republican Party. Do not close this Republican door to these people. Bring it together under the leadership of Pat Buchanan, and we will take it to Bill Clinton, and we will defeat him in the fall and give you the kind of conservative administration Georgia wants.
Thank you. Closing statement now from Lamar Alexander.
I'd like to speak directly to the undecided voters of Georgia, most of whom I think will be choosing on Tuesday between Senator Dole and me. Yesterday in South Carolina, I lost an election. This morning I went to the Peachtree Presbyterian Church here in Atlanta, and I think the preacher, Reverend Harrington, had made up a sermon just for me. He preached about defeat and comeback. And he said one thing that's important to remember after a defeat is to learn from your mistakes. Well, maybe the mistakes of those of us in this presidential business is that we try too hard to win and don't say what's in our heart. So here's what's in my heart. I believe we have a remarkable country. We've got more opportunities than we've ever had. We've got some real problems. People losing jobs, Washington meddling too much, the breakdown of the family and community. But I know what to do about that. I believe there's no excuse for those problems. I spent most of my life creating jobs, rebuilding schools, helping to transform a state. I believe I know what to do. So I would like to persuade you that as you go to vote on Tuesday, that I would be the better choice in trying to defeat Bill Clinton, in trying to persuade the country to re-elect a Republican Congress, in being the first president of the next century, and in creating a rising, shining America with better jobs, better schools, and stronger families. That's what I really believe, and that's why I hope you'll join my campaign, and that's why I hope you'll vote for me on Tuesday.
Thank you. Now the final closing statement from Steve Forbes.
Thank you very much. Alan Keyes should have been part of this debate. He is a serious candidate and he has a serious message, and I hope in the future he will be included. America is at a critical crossroads. We have a crisis today that is economic, spiritual, and military. We have a president who has to get up each morning, read the polls to see what he's supposed to believe that day. Too many of our political leaders today do practice the political equivalent of painting by the numbers. America does have the potential for the greatest economic boom and spiritual renewal in our history. The question in 1996 is, how do we fulfill our promise as a people and as a nation? I've put specific proposals on the table to get America moving again. They all have the common thread and theme of less government and more freedom, of returning opportunity, responsibility, power, and control directly to the American people. When it's in our hands, in the hands of we the people, America moves forward and America's best days will be ahead. I put proposals like the flat tax, it's a tax cut that will save the average Georgia family $1,000 a year. Medical savings accounts that will give the people on Medicare more control, more coverage at less cost. I put forward a new Social Security system for younger Americans so they'll have something when they retire. And we must have parental control of education so our kids get the education they deserve. Working together, my friends, working together, we can rebuild America's moral foundations, we can revive the American economy, and we can renew the American dream. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. Our time for this evening is up. We here at Channel 2 would like to thank the candidates and the panelists for taking part in this debate. We would also like to thank our partners, CNN, the Cable News Network, GPTV, and AM 750 WSB Radio, who are leaving us at this time.
Campaign 96 continues Tuesday with primaries in Colorado, Connecticut, Georgia, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. Vermont and Washington are holding caucuses. On Thursday the 7th, New York holds its primary. We're offering several Campaign 96 products. To order your pocket T-shirt, mug, or cap, call 1-800-523-3174. C-SPAN's online guide to government is available on your personal computer through America Online. It includes photos and biographies of members of Congress, information about how the House and Senate work, and congressional schedules. AOL subscribers use the keyword C-SPAN. Coming back from Camp David, President Clinton made brief remarks about the bombing in Jerusalem on Saturday. Here's what he had to say to reporters on the South Lawn.
The suicide bombing in the Middle East last night shows once again how determined the enemies of peace are. In just a few moments, I will be calling Prime Minister Peres to express our condolences, our solidarity, and our outrage. We must spare no effort here in the United States to support Israel and the other supporters of peace in defeating the forces of terrorism. I will also be in touch with Chairman Arafat and others in the region to ask for their support. It is clear that there are forces at work in the Middle East who don't want peace and who exist based on the continuing misery and division of the people there. And we have got to do everything we can to defeat them and to stand with those in the Middle East, beginning with our friends in Israel who are determined to defeat them. This is a troubling moment, but I am determined to see that it does not defeat the peace process, and I am determined to do everything I can on behalf of the United States to support those who are standing against terrorism and standing for peace. Thank you very much.
What do you think that the Palestinian leadership is doing enough to prevent these kinds of attacks?
Well, I'm going to encourage them to do more, to do everything that they can do, and we'll be working with them over the next few days, and I'm sure we'll be in touch, and we'll be answering more of your questions over the next few days. But we're going to work very hard on it. I do believe that Chairman Arafat has made efforts, and I think he will make more. We have to build the capacity of all the forces in the Middle East, including the Palestinian authorities, to promote law and order and to stand against terrorism. It's going to be a long battle, and we knew that when we started, but I believe we can prevail. Thank you.
This is a victory for a cause. It is the cause of a brand new, bold conservatism.
All across the country, votes are coming in.
And we know that we're now engaged in a fight for the heart and soul of the Republican Party.
It's primary season, and we'll take you through the process.
We're going to win the Republican nomination, we're going to defeat Bill Clinton, and lead this country into the next century.
Thanks to you, we are going to go all the way to San Diego.
Watch Campaign 96 as it unfolds on C-SPAN, the political network of record.
This week on Book Notes, our guest is First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton. She joins us to discuss her recent book, It Takes a Village, and other lessons our children can teach us.
Hillary Rodham Clinton, author of It Takes a Village. What did your mother teach you about raising children?
Oh, she gave me such a good example. My mother, as I write in the book, did not have a traditional upbringing. She was born to a 15-year-old mother and a 17-year-old father, and their marriage didn't last, and she was sent off to live with her grandparents, and that was a very harsh atmosphere. But somehow, through her own personal will and strength, and because of others along the way, teachers and relatives. And when she was 14, she went to work in another woman's house, taking care of that woman's children. And that woman served as an example of a mother. She summed it all up, and she was loving, attentive, involved, caring, gave us a great start in our life.
What about your dad?
My dad had a different kind of upbringing. He came from immigrant family. Both of his parents had come to this country as young children. They were very intent upon working hard. His father went to work when he was 11 in the lace mills in Scranton, and his mother was a very strong-willed woman. One of the things that I have learned in the last several years is that his mother, my formidable grandmother, who died when I was quite young, insisted always on using her maiden name as well, Hannah Jones Rodham. And so I was very surprised to learn that back at the turn of the century, she was someone who stood up for herself and made her views known. And my father had a great upbringing. He went to school in Scranton. He went to Penn State where he played football. And I think for him, having a family and being committed to taking care of them, coming out of the World War II Depression generation was what he thought he should do, and he did it very well.
Were you born in Park Ridge, Illinois?
I was born in Chicago. That's where my parents were living when I was born.
How long did you live in Park Ridge?
Well, we moved there when I was about 4, and my parents moved to Arkansas to be with us after my father had his first stroke back in '87. So they lived there for 37 years.
What did both of them do for a living?
My mother was a homemaker, and my father had a small business that printed and sold draperies. He was usually the only paid employee, but he sometimes had day labor that he hired. He became very close to one man who became kind of a continuing employee, but my mother would help out, my brothers and I would help out.
You had 2 brothers.
Yes, 2 younger brothers.
You and Tony?
That's right.
How much younger were they than you?
Well, Hugh was 4 years younger, and Tony was 7 years younger.
How'd you get along with them?
Well, I think that they would say that when I wasn't bossing them around and being their intolerable big sister, we got along pretty well.
Did your parents treat them any differently than they did you?
I think that, as I say in the book, my father was harder on them. My father had 2 brothers. He was a real, man's man. He was an athlete, and he was a guy who didn't talk a lot and wasn't into, reading books very much, unlike my mother. And so I think he was much harder on my brothers because he really didn't know what to do with me. I mean, both my parents were so encouraging of me, telling me that I could do whatever I want. There were never any distinctions made between boys and girls. If my father was throwing pass patterns around our elm trees, I ran with the boys just as everybody else in the neighborhood did. But he was, I think, a much more demanding father for my brothers.
How did you raise Chelsea different than you were raised?
Well, actually, I've struggled to raise her in the same way, despite the difference in circumstances. We had a very middle-class, normal upbringing, my brothers and I. We were lucky to live in a great suburb with great schools. We could come and go because it was a safe neighborhood. So it's not only the differences that all of us face today that make me sad, because my child's life is not as free and independent as I was able to be, but certainly my husband being a governor and now a president makes it quite different. So I have to struggle all the time to make her life as normal, and by my definition of normal, I fall back on my upbringing.
There's a part in the book where you say that, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that Chelsea wanted to ride her bicycle, and you broke down in tears. For what reason?
Well, she was about 9, and she and a little friend had been riding around the grounds of the governor's mansion, and they came running in and they wanted to ride their bikes down to the library, which was about 10 blocks away. And I just I got tears in my eyes, because nearly every day in the summertime I'd ride my bike to the library, to the pool, to play with my friends, and my mother would say, "Be home in time for dinner," and nobody worried about me. And I had these 2 little girls, and I had to tell them no, I didn't feel comfortable. And it wasn't because her daddy was the governor, it was because they were 2 little girls living in the downtown area of Little Rock, Arkansas, which is, not as safe as it should be or that it used to be. And that just made me very sad. It was one of those moments as a mother that gave me a great deal of regret, that we have not taken care of our society in a way that would enable my daughter to be as free as I was.
Chelsea is brought up in here a lot, and I know that you also read about protecting her from the public light. Did you have to make a decision to even put her in the book? Was that hard to do?
It was really hard to do, Brian. I mean, this book is kind of a hybrid. I mean, it's not a memoir by any means, but it does rely on my personal experiences, both as a daughter and a mother, as well as my work as an advocate and the experts whom I know, trying to get their information out to the public. So I made the decision that I did have to include her, but I was very careful about how I talked about her, and I cleared everything with her. I didn't want her to feel that I was either breaching any confidence or, you know, giving her an uncomfortable moment as a teenager by talking about her.
What's it like raising her in the White House?
Well, it's been a real challenge, but it's something that I probably spent more time on before we moved here than anything else. I had a great conversation, actually 2 of them with Jackie Kennedy Onassis, about raising children in the public eye. I talked with other people. I read a lot of the press coverage of children who were in the White House. And that led both Bill and me to make some decisions about how we would refer to her even, how we would talk about her in public. And really we pled, and I think I'm very grateful that it was so positively received with the press, just to, you know, give her as much space and privacy as they could.
Why do you think they do?
I think that there are a lot of people who are around our age raising children in the press, and I believe that they know what they go through, because if you're, you know, a journalist who's on television or who's well known because of what you write, that gives you a taste of how your children can be drawn into your own career. And certainly it's much more dramatic where we live, but I think they had a certain sympathy and empathy with that.
You also tell a story in the book about how you and the president, when he was governor, warned her about the awful things that were going to be said about both of you, or at least him at the time.
At the time, it was just him.
And then she got upset.
Yes. Well,
Has she been upset lately?
I think we've worked at this so long that certainly she gets a little frustrated and concerned, as would be natural. But starting when she was about 6, as I do tell in the book, I realized that even though her dad had been in politics since she was born, she'd been oblivious to it. She couldn't read. She didn't follow the news. But now that she was reading and in school, that was going to be different. So Bill and I talked about it, and we thought we should try to prepare her. I think that children deserve to have as much information as they're ready to receive at the age that they are. So at dinner we told her that her daddy was going to be running for re-election as governor, and that in elections people said mean things about each other, and we didn't want her to be surprised, and they sometimes told stories about each other. And she was very upset at first. But we have continued to kind of work with her, and we're always talking with her and asking her if she has any questions. So it's never easy, and it's always painful. It's hard on not only my daughter, but on my mother, on other people who care about us. And we do our best to reassure them and to let them know that unfortunately this is part of the process.
You say also that you like to have at least one meal together a day. How often do you get that done?
We get that done every day we're in town. And it's usually dinner. And we sit around and we talk about, you know, just what families talk about, what's going on, and how school was, and where we might go if we can get a few days off, or what is happening with friends. But we try so hard to do that, and it's been something that we've tried all through her life, and we'll keep up as long as we can.
You have a chapter on watching television.
Mm-hmm. Right. I am.
Why?
I just don't think there is any doubt that when I think about the difference in the way I was raised or Bill was raised and the way life was back in the 50s, which a lot of people have a great nostalgia for today, but the single biggest difference is the role of television in our lives. And it's not only the content which does disturb me, it's also the process of television watching, the amount of hours that so many children spend, what it takes them away from doing, the passivity of it, and the instant gratification that it provides. You know, I say in the book that when you have a 2 or 3-year-old all of a sudden being able to control a remote control device and never having to work at play the way that we did, or the kind of frustrating experiences you go through when you're a young child, but just sit there and passively be entertained. It changes the way children learn.
A quote from your own book, you say, well, this is not that big a quote. It says 80% of Americans responding to a 1993 Times Mirror poll said that they believe TV is harmful to society. Do you think that's true?
I think it's true. And I think most people believe it's true, but people feel helpless in the face of it. And I tried in the book to give just some suggestions about what parents could do, what communities could do, so that we take back authority in our own homes as against the television and the popular culture it represents.
Why do you think it's harmful?
I think we have sufficient evidence now, and there have been a number of studies. They haven't gotten as much publicity as I would like. Newton Minow does a wonderful job of summarizing a lot of what we know about the effects of television. And we know that television has desensitized children to violence. Now, clearly, if you come from an unstructured family with a lot of problems to start with, you're going to be more affected than somebody who comes from a more stable environment. But all children are affected. And it's not just boys where there's been an increase in aggressive acting out, it's girls as well. We know that the consumer culture and the kind of manipulation of children that is done even in their own television shows, particularly on commercial television, has had an impact. We know if you compare watching public broadcasting and the educational programming that appears there with children who watch only commercial broadcasting, the children who watch educational programming are better prepared for academic challenges. There are many ways that we know television has impacted kids.
I restricted both the amount and the kind of television Chelsea watched as a child, and even now we check up from time to time on her TV. How do you do that?
Well, we don't have the same kind of control that we used to have when she was smaller, but we, from a very early age, were very careful about what she watched and equally concerned about how much she watched. We didn't let her just plop down in front of the television set. We tried to keep her active doing other things. And you know, now I'll kind of cruise through her room, see if she's watching TV, number one, and kind of check in on what she's watching. But mostly it's by talking with her now. You know, what does she think about certain programs? How does she evaluate them? In the book, I talk about how important it is for parents to be active viewers with their children. We're all going to watch television. You know, Bill and Chelsea and I watch television together. But we try to talk about what television is, how it's very implausible in so many respects. It is drama. You don't solve human problems in, you know, what is it, 27 minutes plus commercials. To try to give children the capacity to separate what they see on television from what we hope they'll see in real life.
Why do you think people in the business who obviously have children and family and all that have done this? Why do you think they sell this stuff?
Well, you know, in the book I talk about how when we drive by an accident on the road, we all watch. We know we shouldn't. I mean, we're all rubbernecking. We have people telling us to move on, don't block the traffic. And it's as though we have a thoroughfare of accidents. It is something that we're compelled to look at. I mean, that's human nature. I don't fault people who are in the business to make money for doing what will draw viewers. But I think it's time for all of us to say, both as viewers, that we have to exercise more self-control and responsibility, at least as it affects children, but also programmers.